Also today, the family of Tamil asylum seekers currently detained on Christmas Island are awaiting a decision tomorrow as to whether they will be allowed to stay or whether they will be deported. And in fact, they could be deported as soon as tomorrow night, depending on how a hearing in the federal court plays out tomorrow. The hearing relates to the youngest daughter in this family, the 2-year-old, and whether she is deserving of a protection visa. If she is, the family will stay. If not, the government's made it very clear they will leave. They've been found not to be refugees at every turn, really, all the way up to the High Court. The Immigration Minister, David Coleman, and the Home Affairs Minister, Peter Dutton, have the power to intervene and allow them to stay, but they won't be doing that. The Senior Minister here, Peter Dutton, the Home Affairs Minister, has made that crystal clear today. He argues this family's hardly a unique case. Hundreds of other Tamil families have been sent back to Sri Lanka.
There are 1,500 people from Sri Lanka who came here originally by boat who have gone back, exactly the same family units. Young boys and girls, mums and dads that wanted a better future in Australia. But as we've said, we're not going to allow people to settle who come by boat.
This couple arrived on separate boats in 2012 and 2013 before Operation Sovereign Borders began. Since then, anyone who arrived by boat was sent to Nauru or Manus Island. But Peter Dutton is concerned about any show of compassion here, any special treatment sending the wrong signal. And he gave a graphic reminder today of what happened last time. Large numbers of asylum seeker boats tried to come.
Fortunately, thank God, this family never went to the bottom of the ocean. But as Christian just pointed out, 1,200 people did. And I get a bit frustrated sometimes that there is no voice for the 1,200, because when you speak to the sailors and you speak to the Australian Border Force marine officers, maritime officers, who were pulling the half-eaten bodies of children out of the water, they were young, innocent boys and girls. And we aren't going to return back to those days.
But there are powerful voices arguing this family should be allowed to stay on the grounds they've been here 6 years, settled in a small town, become part of a community that wants them to stay. Among those who've been urging the government to show some compassion here is 2GB and Sky News host Alan Jones. He wrote a piece today quoting a former Deputy Secretary of the Immigration Department, Abul Rizvi. And Abul Rizvi knows how, of course, the immigration rules are meant to be applied and how the Minister's special powers are meant to be used. He joins me now. Thanks very much for your time.
Hello, David.
This afternoon. Let's talk first about this ministerial power. It's been referred to, I think you've referred to it as the God power here. Quite an extraordinary power the Minister has. How and when is it supposed to be used?
It is supposed to be used when the legislation, when a person applies through the legislation gives you an outcome that the government considers is not in the public interest. So it essentially looks at two grounds. One, whether it's in the national interest to intervene, and secondly, on compelling and compassionate issues.
That's a fairly broad scope.
Absolutely, and we've seen the power used in very broad ways, as you'd be aware.
Well, in fact, there was evidence to the Senate inquiry into the whole au pair saga, where Peter Dutton did use this power in relation to those au pairs, that he was actually using it quite a bit. The evidence was it was used more than 4,000 times between the end of December, the end of 2014 and August of last year, 2018. Do we know much about the circumstances in which it is being used?
No, we don't. Apart from the two au pair cases, we don't. Right. But what it appears is that Mr Dutton is a lot softer than he pretends he is.
Well, there may be compassionate reasons. There's another case we are aware of, a young Rohingya child who was in Nauru. His parents had been killed in Myanmar before they fled on before he at least fled amongst others on a boat. I think the Nauruan government specifically asked for the power to be used to bring him to Australia. The department here said, no, not a good idea, it'll send the wrong message, but Peter Dutton did allow this child to be settled in Australia. I mean, is that a good example of where it should be used?
Well, if the reason for it to be used was foreign relations, that seems an odd set of circumstances. But as we've discussed, it's a very, very broad power, and it really is entirely up to the discretion of the Minister, and it usually reflects the values of the individual person.
So with this Tamil family currently detained on Christmas Island, what do you think would be the reasons justifying the use of this power?
There would be two reasons. One would be the compelling and compassionate reasons, which is the level of support in the Australian community. And I in my time as in the Immigration Department, signed off many of these submissions. And a crucial factor was always the level of community support. And I have never seen a case with this level of community support.
Should that be, though, how decisions are made based on how much community support there is? Is that something that asylum seekers should be trying to build as part of their case?
That is not part of the legislation, certainly.
No.
But that's what discretion is about. It is about responding to a circumstance where the level of community support is so strong that it is appropriate to do that.
But how does someone get that community support?
Well, these people have gone about it by settling in a remote town, doing the right thing, getting a job, volunteering in the local community, becoming good citizens of that local community for a long time. That seems a pretty good outcome to me.
What do you say, though, to Peter Dutton's argument today? There are 1,500 other Tamils who have been sent back who came by boat, and plenty of them have family situation, little boys and girls and so on. Why is this family any different to them?
Two reasons. One, as I mentioned, the level of community support, just quite extraordinary. The second is, it is in the national interest, given the government's immigration priorities are to encourage more young families to settle in regional Australia. These people fit the bill.
Because of the regional aspect of this.
And we all know that remote and regional towns in Australia, many of them, such as Biloela, are in quite some trouble in terms of their long-term ageing and demographic profiles.
Just on that, because I think that the Prime Minister made the point yesterday, they're quite entitled, once back in Sri Lanka, to apply for a visa through the regular channels. Do you think there's any prospect they would be given favourable status?
Well, that is a good thing for the government to have said, because that then opens up an opportunity for discussion. The door is not entirely shut. But if they were sent back to Sri Lanka, they would face a number of obstacles in trying to come back. They would not be in the same position as anybody else, to use Mr Dutton's words.
Why not?
Firstly, because on their files it would be written that they were deported from Australia, and that would count against them in any application that they made.
So that the department, just explain that to me, the department would automatically see an application where a box is ticked saying I have been deported from Australia. That's going to make it pretty hard for them to get any future visa.
That would ring the alarm bells immediately. The second problem would be this family would have attached to them now a very substantial debt to the Commonwealth. And I suspect the debt would be very, very large given how long they've been held in detention.
Just explain that to me. What debt do they incur?
So they were held in detention for approximately a year. There was transport associated with charter flights flying them to
Melbourne and Darwin
and to Christmas Island.
Do they cop a debt for all of this?
Yes, they do. They cop a debt for all of that.
The detention.
That debt is held against them.
And they'll carry that when they return to Sri Lanka if they're deported?
Correct. So if they make an application from Sri Lanka, the immigration officer will look at not only the deportation, but the immigration officer will look at the fact that they have a debt to the Commonwealth, and they will say the debt to the Commonwealth must be dealt with before we can grant a visa.
So what you're saying here is, and unless there's some decision to waive that debt, unless there's some decision to waive the fact that they were deported from Australia, which would, again, I guess, require some sort of ministerial intervention.
Yes.
There's very little chance they're going to have of coming back through any other visa.
I would say zero chance. In fact, I don't think they would even have the chance to come to visit their friends in Biloela for a few weeks. They would not even be allowed to do that. But there is a way out of this. And the way out of this, if the government is genuine about putting them in a position similar to, quote, anybody else, would be for the minister to intervene and not grant them a permanent visa, but grant them a visitor visa. Exactly as Mr Dutton did with the two nannies. Grant them a visitor visa. Therefore, not setting the extraordinary precedent that the government is worried about. The visitor visa then would enable the family to approach the employer in Biloela to see if the employer would sponsor them for a work visa. Now, if they met the criteria for the work visa, they would be able to remain in Biloela on that temporary work visa for a period of years and eventually accrue enough time to be able to obtain permanent residence.
Through the regional settlement pathway.
Correct.
So you're saying this could be done while they're here in Australia now, give them a temporary visitor visa. They would then have to be sponsored by an employer. Given the community support, you'd think that shouldn't be too difficult to arrange.
You wouldn't
through
think?
The abattoir where the father's been working or somewhere else.
My understanding is that Taze Brothers, and I dealt with Taze Brothers quite extensively when I was in the Department of Immigration, is a very good employer.
Right. All right, so this pathway that you're talking about there could lead ultimately to them staying permanently.
It could, but the important thing is it puts the family in as close a position as possible to the position the government has described, that is, like anybody else applying for a visa. The problem is if they were sent back to Sri Lanka, they would not be like anybody else. They would have all those penalties that I've just described.
The other concern Peter Dutton and the Prime Minister expressed is about sending any wrong signal to people smugglers, that a show of compassion here, special treatment, will be used by people smugglers to market their wares. Are they right about that?
To be frank with you, no, David. We know what happened when boat turn-back policy was in place under the Howard government. The Howard government resettled hundreds of people during that period. But because turn-back policy was in place, there was never any concern that large numbers of boats would get through, and they didn't. Howard and Ruddock were in fact quite compassionate, comparatively, because they resettled all the people on Manus and Nauru, predominantly in Australia and some in New Zealand. There were no signal problems there.
So the boat turnbacks is the key here. That wasn't in place in the lead up to 2013 when all those boats came. Now it's back in place.
Boat turnbacks has always been the key.
We will see what happens tomorrow on this front with the Federal Court hearing. Abul Rizvi, thank you very much for joining me. Good to talk to you.
You're welcome.
Appreciate that.